Hello, everybody. It's time for lecture on respiratory system, chapter 13. If you want to follow along with me, that's cool. Hope you're all doing okay. Hope you're all being safe and following the rules of quarantining and maintaining social distance as we try to run this pandemic through. Anyway, I'm starting to lose my mind. I would much rather be in class in front of you guys than having to reach you like this, but this is the way it is for now. So anyway, let's go over the notes. Okay. So the respiratory system, remember, this is a close cousin of the cardiovascular system because it's closely connected to the heart and the blood, right? We have one whole side of the heart, the right side of the heart, that is designed to sending blood to the lungs, and that the reason why it does that is so the blood becomes oxygenated, and then the blood leaves the lungs, comes back to the heart, and then the left side of the heart feeds that oxygenated blood to the tissues. So the main job of the respiratory system is to deliver oxygen. It's also to remove carbon dioxide. As the air comes in, we have some structures in the upper respiratory system in the nose and in the nasal cavity that filters the air. The lungs are also an important organ for maintaining your blood pH. And our blood pH a lot of times is maintained through the rate at which we remove carbon dioxide. So just think of carbon dioxide being an acid. And as we are not breathing so much, the carbon dioxide builds up. So acid levels build up in the blood, and that you would go into what's called acidosis. The opposite of that would be if we're breathing too quickly, removing too much carbon dioxide, you're losing too much acid and the blood becomes alkaline. And then, of course, we have a larynx. And we use the larynx as we pass air through the vocal cords to produce sounds. So we could kind of divide the system into two parts: the upper respiratory tract, that includes the nose, the navel cavity, and the pharynx, all the way up into the larynx. Once we reach the larynx, we enter into the trachea. Now we're in the lower respiratory tract. So the lower respiratory tract includes the trachea here. The left, this is the bronchial tree that separates the trachea into left and right bronchi, and then the bronchi divide even further, creating bronchioles, right? Primary bronchioles to secondary bronchioles to tertiary bronchioles, eventually leading to terminal bronchioles, which at the very end of those terminals bronchioles, we have the air sacs, which is the site of gas exchange. All right. So if we look at the very beginning where air is coming in through the nose, we could find there's filtering units in the nose itself through the nostrils, and they come in the form of hairs. But as we get past that into the nasal cavity, we have mucus. And as the air passes through the mucus, what happens is a couple of things. Well, the mucus will further filter the air and trap any debris that might be in the air. But there's also blood vessels in there, so the air not only gets filtered, but it gets warmed as it passes through the blood vessels that are close to the surface. And in addition to that, it moistens the air, the mucus does. So instead of having cold, dry, unfiltered air reaching our lungs, we have filtered, warm, moist air that is going all the way down into the lower respiratory tract. In the trachea, we have these specialized cells called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells. And remember, ciliated means that they have these little hair-like structures that stick out. If there's any debris getting trapped in the mucus of the respiratory tract, the ciliated cells will send that debris back where it came from. All right. The pharynx is your throat. The pharynx is a common passageway for not only air, but also for food. And we could divide that into the area right behind your nose, as we call that the nasal pharynx. Behind your mouth would be the oropharynx, right behind the tongue. And then we have the laryngopharynx, which is where it's the part of the throat that's right above the larynx. All right, so this is your nasal cavity. Then we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx. So the air, as it comes in through the nasal cavity, is filtered, warmed, moistened, and then it travels down here into this anterior tube, which is called the trachea. The posterior tube, as you remember from our pig dissection, was the esophagus. So that's for food. Air goes down this way. And we have this little flap here. This flap isn't labeled on this diagram, but this flap is called the epiglottis. And when we're swallowing food, this flap covers the trachea. This opening at the top of the trachea right here is called the glottis. This flap, which is called the epiglottis, covers the glottis, diverting the food back towards the posterior tube, which is the esophagus. All right, so if we look closely at the epiglottis, we can see it's composed almost entirely of cartilage. It says it holds the respiratory tract open. That's because this cartilage comes in the form of C shapes, right? This is called cricoid cartilage. And if we look from the posterior view, from the back, you can see that the cartilage rings don't meet up in the back. They're C-shaped. They're not O-shaped. And the reason is because the esophagus has to fit here. And when food is running through the esophagus, we don't want these cartilage rings getting in the way. But these cartilage rings keep this tube open all the way down. And inside here we have vocal cords. As we pass the air through the vocal cords, they vibrate and they produce sounds that we would then use for speech. All right, so the larynx is commonly called the voice box because it's the location of the vocal cords. All right, the front of the larynx, we have that large thyroid cartilage, which in men, the testosterone stimulates the thickening and the growth of that cartilage, causing it to become larger, protruding out, forming what's called the Adam's apple, which is visible. Again, that epiglottis is right above right here, at the top of the larynx, covering the opening of the trachea, called the glottis, preventing food from entering the trachea. And then those cartilage rings are called cricoid rings, and they're responsible for keeping that trachea open. When you lie flat on your back, you don't want the tube closing in on itself because it'll become difficult to breathe. You want to keep that zone open. All right, so the main function of the lower respiratory tract now, as opposed to the upper respiratory tract, is to move the air that we are inhaling to the respiratory membrane. So we have to pass air through the trachea, through the bronchial tree, which diverts the air into two lungs. And then once inside the lungs, it goes through the conducting zone, right? So that's the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles. Inside the lungs, the bronchioles split into secondary bronchioles, tertiary bronchioles, and finally terminal bronchioles. It's deep within the lungs that we find the respiratory zone. And this is the site of gas exchange. So it's at the very end of the terminal bronchioles that we have these grape-like looking structures called the alveoli. All right, if we look at the alveoli up close, you could imagine that there's a lot of blood vessels on them. Remember, we send the blood from the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So it's in these respiratory zones, these alveoli, that the blood is picking up oxygen. So each grape-like cluster, alveolar sac, is associated with capillaries. So there's a lot of blood in the lungs. So here's a closer look at the lower respiratory tract, starting with the larynx. So when the larynx leads to the trachea, we see those cricoid cartilage rings going all the way down. They continue into the lungs even, with primary bronchus, left and right bronchus. And then they will continue until we get to the bronchioles, which are deep in the lungs. Then we lose the cricoid cartilage rings. Without those rings, if there's inflammation in the lungs, then those tubes can close on themselves, right? Something like bronchitis, for example, would cause inflammation in the lungs, and I have to pause this. All right, I have to let my dog outside. He was barking. Anyway, I forgot what we were talking about. If we look at the lungs, you can see there's a little bit of difference between the left lung over here and the right lung. The left lung has this notch cut out of it. This is called a cardiac notch. And of course, this is where the heart would sit. If you look at the number of lobes, too, the right lung has 3 lobes, where the left lung has 2 lobes. And then we see this big sheet of muscle, the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that controls breathing, but it also has this separating membrane that separates this cavity, this complete cavity that houses the lungs and heart, called the thoracic cavity, from the cavity below it, which is the abdominal cavity. All right, so the trachea connects the larynx to the bronchi. There's about between 16 to 20 of these C-shaped cartilage rings in there. Remember, the back of it doesn't have those rings, and that's what allows the esophagus to expand. It doesn't interfere with that. At the very base of the trachea, that area is called the carina. And it's very sensitive. If anything gets down in that area and touches the sides of the trachea, it triggers a dramatic cough reflex. All right. So the lower portion of the conducting zone and the respiratory zone are referred to as the bronchial tree. So as the trachea splits into 2 tubes, we call them the primary bronchi. So there'd be a left bronchus and a right bronchus. They would further divide into secondary bronchi. Now, this is inside the lungs. All right. So the right bronchus divides into 3 secondary bronchi. The left one divides into 2 secondary bronchi. And then this pattern continues, getting smaller and smaller as the tubes extend further and further away from the bronchi. Just keep in mind that as we get further and further, we eventually split into these structures called bronchioles. It's within the bronchioles that we lose the C-shaped cartilage rings. So these areas are more susceptible to becoming inflamed and closing as let's say, an irritant or an allergen or a pathogen causes mucus to build up, or an inflammatory response. All right. As the bronchial tree goes deeper and deeper, we see 2 major changes happening. The cells of the mucous membrane are getting smaller. So with smaller cells, we see an increase in mucus secretions, all right? Now, look, if dust gets back there, because we have fewer cells, ciliated cells this deep, the cilia cannot brush the debris back up where it came from. The debris kind of gets stuck down there. So we rely more on macrophages to penetrate that area and remove that unwanted debris. Macrophages are a type of white blood cell that have the ability to leave circulation, leave the blood, and enter into the tissues. Macrophage literally means large eaters. So these cells would go into that area and they would find this debris, whatever it may be. They would engulf it and get rid of it. All right. The composition of the walls of the bronchi and bronchioles change also. So again, the amount of cartilage decreases as we go in. And at the same time, the amount of smooth muscle will increase. Okay, so again, once again, I think this is the third time I'm saying this. Without the cricoid cartilage, these smaller tubes can completely become shut by the contraction or the overcontraction of the smooth muscle. And this would happen during an inflammatory response. All right. Okay, so the lungs are the key organs of respiration. All right. If we look at the lungs, they actually extend right above the clavicle. The clavicle is your collarbone here, and the apex of the lung protrudes just above that clavicle. And then it goes down to the 12th thoracic vertebra, and they completely fill the rib cage, and they sit right on top of that muscular layer called the diaphragm. The right lung is a little bit shorter, fatter, with 3 lobes. The left lung is thinner with only 2 lobes. The left lung has the cardiac notch on the medial side. We have these membranes that surround the lungs. They're called serous membranes. Anytime we see serous membranes, we should be thinking to ourselves that these are membranes that produce fluids, lubricating fluids. And they come in 2 different kinds. We have visceral serous membranes. Visceral surround the viscera. And viscera is another word that means organs. So if we have a serous membrane surrounding an organ, it's a visceral serous membrane. And then we have serous membranes that line the cavity walls, and these are called parietal serous membranes. When we're looking at the lungs, we have a membrane that surrounds the lungs, really right up snug against the tissue of the lungs. That's called the visceral pleural membrane. And then lining the walls behind it, the thoracic walls, we have the walls of the thoracic cavity, the parietal pleura. Right? But that creates a space between the two that we refer to the space as the pleural cavity. And it's here in that space that we see fluids, the pleural fluids. And these, again, are for lubrication. Remember, as the lungs fill with air, they get bigger. And then when we exhale, they get smaller. So the lungs are moving. When they move, they tend to rub up against things. And in particular, they rub up against the walls of the cavity. So whenever we have things rubbing up against each other, they have the tendency to wear or erode against each other. So to minimize that, we put a lot of lubrication there, and that prevents that. So here you can see the apex of the lung protruding above the clavicle, and then the bottom or the base of the lung would go down all the way down to about the 12th thoracic vertebra. All right, and so snug right up against the lung, we would have the visceral pleura. Outside of that, superior to that, we would have, not superior, superficial to that, I should say. We have the parietal pleura, and between the two, we have that pleural cavity, which is filled with pleural fluids. So this is an image of what's called the bronchial pulmonary segment. So we see a little bit of a terminal bronchiole, and at the very end, we have the alveolar sacs. Again, I told you these are like grape-like sacs. They look like little bunches of grapes, and you can see there are a lot of blood vessels around each of these sacs, and we have many, many sacs, thousands and thousands of sacs within each lung. So you can see the blue blood vessels would be carrying deoxygenated blood. So these are pulmonary arteries that are going down into the lungs, and they bring deoxygenated blood. And it's here that that deoxygenated blood picks up oxygen. And then that oxygenated blood would then leave the lungs through the pulmonary veins going back to the heart, specifically on the left side of the heart. All right. So again, if you see anything, it looks like a bunch of grapes, it's probably the alveoli, which are an important component of the bronchial pulmonary segments. There's air in here. A slice of this has been removed, and you can see there's air in there. So because this is the trachea, so the air we breathe in goes down and fills this space. All right, so again, gases are diffusing in the alveoli, right? This is the site of gas exchange. Um, the walls of the alveolar sacs are very thin. The walls consist of one layer of cells. One cell makes up that alveolar wall. But then we have one more cell making up the capillary wall. So together, the gases have to cross two cells, the walls of the capillaries and the walls of the alveolar wall. So if you're breathing in oxygen, and the oxygen, once it fills that alveolar sac, goes through the first cell of the alveolar wall and then through the second cell of the capillaries to get into the blood. We do have these other cells down here called septal cells, and they produce a very important secretion protein, which is called surfactant. Surfactant is a detergent-like secretion. And what that does is when we exhale these grape-like sacs, what they would want to do as the air is leaving, the inner walls would want to cling to each other like that. But that's not good for our breathing sacs, right? You have to have the walls clinging to each other. So we line the walls. The septal cells line the walls of the alveoli with this detergent-like protein called surfactant, and that prevents the walls from clinging to each other during exhalation. All right. Surfactant is one of the last things that our body produces as we're being developed embryonically. If so, babies that are born prematurely, usually the limiting factor is breathing, because the septal cells have yet to produce surfactant and the walls are clinging to each other, making it more difficult for premature babies to breathe. So they would have to be put into some type of situation where a respirator would be breathing for them. All right. This is another picture that we already saw. This is an actual image. So this is showing you a terminal bronchiole. There's blood vessels right here. But all these little sacs are the alveoli. You can see how many there are. There's many, many. Okay, so this is a good picture. So what are we looking at here? This is the inside of an alveolus. There we have septal cells. The septal cells are producing surfactants, that detergent-like protein. Here we see capillary, and this is the wall of the alveolar sac. You can see this wall is only one cell thin right here. And then we have another wall creating the capillary wall, which is also one cell thin. So as the gases come in and fill this area, oxygen, for example, it has to go through this wall and then the wall of the capillary in order to reach the blood. So the respiratory membrane, which is a moist membrane, it's important for this area to be moist because that facilitates the diffusion of gases. This respiratory membrane is 2 cells thick. All right, so diffusion, it happens very easily. Here we have macrophages patrolling the area, looking for any debris or undesirables that might have reached this deep into the respiratory, the lower respiratory zone. All right, so again, filling the space is air. The oxygen diffuses from the air, so from the alveoli into the blood, and the blood is carrying amounts of carbon dioxide. So this is where the carbon dioxide will be leaving the blood and entering into the lungs, and that carbon dioxide will be expelled upward. All right. All right. So we have respiration. Respiration happens as a result of an interplay between the lungs and the blood, right? The lungs put oxygen into the blood, and then the blood gets moved around, delivering the oxygen throughout the whole body. So the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system are responsible for respiration. It's in the pulmonary capillaries that the gases are exchanged between the blood and the lungs. And it's within the systemic capillaries that the gases are exchanged between the blood and the body's tissues. All right. Pulmonary ventilation happens as a result of what's called Boyle's law. There's an inverse relationship when it comes to Boyle's law, and that relationship happens between volume and pressure. For example, whenever we have an inverse relationship, as something goes up, the other thing goes down. As something goes down, the other thing goes up. So as volume goes up, pressure goes down. And as volume goes down, pressure goes up. You could imagine if you have a ball, like a small inflatable ball, and you can imagine if the ball is missing a little bit of air, so it's nice and soft. If you squeeze that ball, right, you would be decreasing the volume of the ball. So inside the ball, the pressure would increase, right? So that's just a very simple explanation of Boyle's law, the inverse relationship. So this kind of explains how breathing is possible. When we're breathing, what happens is the diaphragm goes downward and the rib expands. So what that does is that increases the volume of the chest cavity. If we're increasing the volume of our chest cavity, it's going to cause a decrease in pressure. And that's what causes the air to go in and fill that void. When we relax the diaphragm, it goes back upward. And we relax the muscles of the ribs, it comes back inward. And this decreases the volume of our rib cage. If we decrease the volume of the rib cage, it's going to increase the pressure in there, and that's going to force the air out, right? So it takes energy, right? We use energy to increase the rib cage, to inhale, right? But then we relax our muscles. When we relax the muscles, everything comes back in. The diaphragm comes up, the ribs come in, causes an increase in pressure in the chest cavity, forcing the air out. All right, so if we take a close look, we have these intercostal muscles between the ribs that we use to help expand the rib cage. We have this diaphragm here. All right, the external obliques get involved. The rectus abdominis muscles are getting involved. All these muscles are getting involved in the expansion of the rib cage. When the rib cage is expanded by these muscles, inhalation is the result. And when we relax these muscles, exhalation is the result. And it's because of volume. Inhalation happens as we increase volume. We decrease pressure down here. And if there's a decrease in pressure, air wants to go in and fill that void. If we measure the atmospheric pressure of the air, it measures roughly about 760 millimeters of mercury. All right. When we inhale and we create a larger volume, what that does is it's going to decrease the pressure down to 758 millimeters of mercury. So that's going to cause the air from out here, which is at a higher pressure, to enter and fill that void. All right. When we exhale, what happens is we're decreasing the volume of the lungs, increasing the pressure. When we decrease the amount of space in the chest cavity, the pressure goes up to 762 millimeters of mercury, and that forces air out because that's greater than 760, which is atmospheric pressure. Your respiratory rate is governed by your brainstem. In the brainstem, we have the medulla oblongata. We also have the pons, and the medulla sets the rhythm of your breathing. And however, of course, this could be overridden by higher brain functions. And we see that happening when we start to run up and down the stairs. You'll start to breathe more, right? And this happens as a result of we have carbon dioxide sensitive receptor cells that are scattered in the body. One of those places is in the aorta. If carbon dioxide levels are detected to be elevated, that's going to cause your breathing to become elevated. Right. We could measure the volume of our breath during normal breathing. This is called tidal volume. 500 milliliters of air is a typical volume for normal breathing, or forced inhalation. If we were to be able to meet in the lab, we would do an exercise where we would measure our what do we call that? Our vital capacity, excuse me. Usually in males, it's a little bit higher because males tend to have larger lungs, but it usually ranges between 3,000 and 5,000 milliliters, the vital capacity. So the vital capacity is the sum of the reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume. So what that means is you take a deep breath in, you exhale, deep breath in, exhale, and then on the third one, you would use a spirometer, and you would send air through that spirometer for as long as you possibly can until no more air is coming out, and that is your vital capacity. Now, as I'm breathing normally, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, I have, like I said earlier, about 500 milliliters of air going in, going out, in and out. After a normal breath, I could still continue to force more air out of my lungs. That amount of air that comes out, if I wanted to, after a normal breath is taken, is called the reserve volume or residual volume. All right. All right. So these would be things that we would be experimenting with in lab. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do that, but maybe we could find a video on that could help make more sense of that. So we have external respiration, and then we have internal respiration. All right, so external respiration happens between the blood and the lungs. So this is gas exchanged between the lungs and the blood. Internal respiration is respiration that's happening between the blood and the tissues. You can see gases moving independently down its partial pressure gradients. All right, so if we have oxygen entering into the lungs, the partial pressure gradient of oxygen is at 104 milliliters of mercury, compared to the oxygen levels in the blood, which is at 100. So that's going to go down. It's going to go from high to low. So that's going to force oxygen into the blood. And then when the blood goes to the cells have an oxygen concentration of less than 40. So that's going to cause the oxygen in the blood to leave the blood and continue down its partial pressure gradient, entering into those cells. Same thing with carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide levels inside the cells is greater than 45, but in the blood it is about 45. So if it's greater than 45 in the cells, it's going to cause the carbon dioxide to move from the cells down its partial pressure gradient into the blood and then into the lungs, which has a partial pressure gradient of 40. So 45 is greater than 40. When it gets to the lungs, it's going to enter the lungs. And then it's really low in the atmosphere. So that's going to help get the carbon dioxide out of the lungs into the atmosphere. So everything is flowing downhill from the air, 159, into the lungs, 104, into the blood, 100, and then into the cells, less than 40. That was oxygen. Carbon dioxide from greater than 45 to 45, from 45 to 40, and from 40 to 0.3 millimeters of mercury. So that's also is moving down its partial pressure gradient. And then we have cell respiration as well. So what does that mean? That means that the oxygen is moving once at the tissues. It has to go into the cells, right? It has to be combined with some type of food nutrient, usually glucose, at the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are going to convert that into energy, into a molecular form of energy that's usable to us, which is called ATP. All right, so we have external respiration between the blood and the lungs. We have internal respiration between the blood and the tissues, and then we have cell respiration between the right outside the cells and then into the cells at the mitochondria. You can see that oxygen is mostly moved around in the blood by red blood cells. Over here it says about 98.5% of the oxygen is moved as oxyhemoglobin, which means it's attached to red blood cells. A very small percentage of oxygen is being transported as dissolved oxygen in the plasma. Where if we look at the transport of carbon dioxide, most of the carbon dioxide is being transported as this bicarbonate ion molecule. Some carbon dioxide is transported by the red blood cells in the form of carboxyhemoglobin. And then we have a small percentage, about 7% of the carbon dioxide is being transported as dissolved carbon dioxide in the plasma. Okay, so hemoglobin is an iron-rich molecule that we find on the surface of the red blood cells. And it has an affinity for oxygen. All right. It also has an affinity to other things. For example, if the red blood cells are in the presence of carbon monoxide, it has a stronger affinity of carbon monoxide, so it'll have a tendency to let go of oxygen and bind to carbon monoxide strongly, which is what makes carbon monoxide so dangerous. All right, so hemoglobin is the molecule that is best known for carrying oxygen. All right, but it also carries a moderate amount of carbon dioxide through the bloodstream as well. All right, so again, everything is affected by pH and temperature, right? And we talked about this several times before, specifically proteins, right? Well, hemoglobin is a protein, and proteins work best under a very narrow range or specific range of pH and temperature. Usually this temperature is body temperature, right? Anything above body temperature, the proteins become denatured and then function goes down. And for hemoglobin, it happens at functionality peaks at the pH of normal blood pH. Unlike, let's say, for example, stomach enzymes in the stomach, like pepsinogen, for example, functions best at acidic pH, right? Because it's a stomach acid where there's a lot of hydrochloric acid. These enzymes that are in the blood function best at the normal blood pH. So that's anywhere between 7.35 and 7.45. If blood pH is elevated as a result of blood alkalosis, well, hemoglobin is not going to work as good. If blood pH is too low as a result of acidosis, let's say carbon dioxide levels are building up in the blood, well, that the function of hemoglobin is not going to work as well. Okay, so just like all proteins in the body, there's a narrow range of pH and temperature that need to be maintained in order to maintain functionality. Okay, so when carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, it forms carbaminohemoglobin. Again, this is kind of rare. Only about 7% of carbon dioxide is carried this way. Most of the carbon dioxide is being transported in the form of bicarbonate ions in the plasma. These bicarbonate ions are also useful because they are a buffering tool that helps to control or manipulate the pH of the blood. This is just showing you for a red blood cell, carbon dioxide from hemoglobin, then leaving the hemoglobin, crossing the respiratory membrane, and going into the lungs. Oxygen from the lungs crossing the respiratory membrane, being transported as oxyhemoglobin. And here we see some bicarbonate ions are dissolved in the plasma as well, which would then be removed at the respiratory membranes. All right, transport of carbon dioxide. And then again at the tissues, so this was the lung, now we're at the tissues. The tissues are going to be producing carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide enters the bloodstream, either as carbaminohemoglobin or bicarbonate ions. Okay, sinusitis. Anytime we see anything ending with itis, that's usually that means inflammation and swelling. So if we find it in the sinuses, it's sinusitis. If it's acute sinusitis, it's the kind of sinusitis that comes and goes within a couple of days. If it's chronic, that means it's more severe and it lingers. People who suffer from chronic sinusitis are people who suffer with allergies and asthma, or people who have a compromised immune system. So inflammation of the upper respiratory tract, and specifically the sinuses or the larynx, we refer to that as sinusitis. Diseases of the lower respiratory tract come in two different forms. We have obstructive, and that means that something is getting in the way of the flow of gases. There's something blocking it, something somewhere. Or constrictive, that means the airways, the pathway of air, that tube has become narrowed or constricted. All right, so bronchitis, for example, which is inflammation of the bronchioles, is a constrictive respiratory disease, and that happens. Those bronchioles are becoming more and more narrow or constricted as a result of inflammation, and as a result of mucus building up. So acute bronchitis would be something that is caused by a virus or bacteria, and it comes and stays for a couple of weeks, and then you get better. Where chronic bronchitis is lingering, it lasts a really long time. Smoking would be something that would cause that. Asthma is a constrictive pulmonary disease that happens as a result of some type of irritant or allergen that is having a negative effect on the smooth muscles of the bronchioles, right? So mucus will again begin to increase in production, and then the bronchioles swell, and that interferes with the passage of the air. Other obstructive pulmonary diseases include pneumonia, tuberculosis, emphysema, lung cancer. In all of these, after exhaling, the tubes of the airway don't spring back open because elastic tissue is destroyed. In all of these, pressure builds up in the lungs, and the patient tries to force air through the collapsed tubes. This becomes damaging to the very delicate alveoli and reduces respiratory surface area. In pulmonary fibrosis, we have an increase in collagen and a decrease in the elastic tissues, and that makes the alveoli rigid, right? And this happens as a result of irritants that you may be exposed to, occupational exposures, for example. It makes me think of the responders of 9/11 that had to go down to ground zero and breathe in the air down there. It had irritants. A lot of these people are experiencing COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, because of the exposure to these occupational irritants. All right. So this chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is actually two diseases. It's emphysema and chronic bronchitis. So it causes inflammation not only does it cause inflammation of the bronchial tubes, but it causes a loss of elasticity or an increase in rigidity of the respiratory surfaces. Cigarette smoking is another thing that could cause emphysema. All right. Emphysema could cause holes in the alveoli. These alveoli, which are supposed to be thin, elastic structures, are becoming fibrotic, stiff, as they lose elasticity. All right. This usually starts gradually, and you will experience shortness of breath, but increases with age, and it is irreversible. Smoking is the major cause of this. Pneumonia is caused by bacteria. Remember, pneumonia like moist, warm places, and the lungs are perfect for that. All right, so this is an obstructive disease. Pneumonia and tuberculosis. And it's obstructive because it causes the fluids to build up in the lungs. So these inflamed alveolar membranes are secreting fluids in an attempt to get rid of these pathogens, but these fluids interfere with gas exchange. Gas is being exchanged across the respiratory surface. So cough, lethargy, fever, shortness of breath, these are all symptoms. Tuberculosis is another one, caused by a bacteria. Cough, fever, chills, same thing. Antibiotics are usually the cure for this. Lung cancer is another obstructive disease because what's getting in the way of airflow through the lungs? Well, a tumor, right? All right. So 90% of lung cancer patients in the United States are smokers. All right, so stop smoking if you're a smoker. All right, because cancer can obstruct the airflow and prevent gases from being exchanged. Cystic fibrosis is unique because it's not really caused by a pathogen or an irritant or an allergy. It's caused as a result of a genetic disorder. There's a certain amount of mucus that's supposed to be produced in the lungs, and this mucus is supposed to have a certain consistency to it. People with cystic fibrosis have a gene that causes an increased production of a thicker, sticky mucus rather than a thin, fluid-like mucus. And what this does is it builds up in the lungs and it traps bacteria and it slows down breathing. And there's a lot of people who are born with this, and most people don't make it very long, unfortunately. But there are new therapies, and we can see some people living longer than they used to. All right, so that's our presentation for today. If you have any questions, please email me. Okay, take care.